Ontology and Metaphysics. If all of philosophy is like a tree, metaphysics is its roots. Physics is the trunk of the tree, and other sciences are like branches growing from this trunk. We can group these branches under three main headings: medicine, mechanics, and ethics. It is through moral philosophy, that is, the highest and most perfect moral philosophy, that we arrive at the highest and most perfect knowledge of other sciences. Rene Descartes. In the previous section, we tried to explain what the fundamental disciplines in philosophy mean. We emphasized that philosophy is based on knowledge, but it is also an action. In this section, we will examine the most important disciplines that show how philosophy, as a theoretical activity, turns into action. That is, we will discuss ontology and metaphysics. The meaning of ontology, which is at the heart of these disciplines, ontology, which should be considered together with ethics, epistemology, and politics, requires the construction of these disciplines as a whole. The lack of one of these disrupts the integrity of ontology, as well as the integrity of philosophy as a system. Moreover, they must have a solid relationship with each other. Questions such as how the world began and where our soul comes from are related to the existence and creation of God. From this point of view, the concept of God is a concept at the center of ontology, and theology forms the center of ontology. An excerpt from Aristotle's book Metaphysics may help us understand this issue better. Every being, from a real individual made up of matter and form, such as Socrates or Callias, in contrast to the unclear nature of forms, to the only being that is real in an absolute sense and in transcendence, which transcendence does not rule out its inherent effect on all beings in this world, finds its place in the chain and hierarchy of forms that ascend to the purely divine act, which is the source and purpose of all beings in this world. To know God is to know all special substances, for things exist only through their forms and can only be understood through them, and again because forms are connected to God and are directed towards God as they are directed towards the highest good for themselves. Their eternal, everlasting existence and closeness to reason determine their degree of existence. Therefore, metaphysics is theology, since its subject is being, and in the absolute sense, being is the absolute mind in being as being, which is God. We saw the system collapse in the modern era. Although the concept of God continued to be used in the modern era, metaphysics, which is the basis of the system, began to collapse as it ceased to be central. Here, we need to state two important points that we will explain later. First, Leibniz's proposal of ontology, that is, the science of being instead of metaphysics, his desire to revive metaphysics as a system, is related to the fact that metaphysics began to lose its integrity. Secondly, parallel to Leibniz's efforts to save metaphysics under a new name, another attempt will be made by the German philosopher Kant. Kant proposes moral metaphysics instead of knowing metaphysics theoretically, that is, a concept like God. Kant, 1984. According to this philosopher, moral metaphysics is not about knowing God, but about revealing what God can contribute to us in a moral sense. But more importantly, this new field of moral metaphysics is a natural result of centering man, not God. Another way the term metaphysics is used actually refers to its emergence. The name metaphysics was given by Aristotle's students who took notes on his lectures because it was the lecture given after the physics lectures. Because the Greek word meta means after, therefore metaphysics, after physics that is, it is used in the sense of after the lessons on nature. Here, as fundamental disciplines, philosophy, for example, to explain why it made physics a new discipline or science, let's take a closer look at Aristotle, who also guided the classification of other sciences. Taking and examining things one by one has never been the subject of philosophy in a positive sense, because philosophy is basically a conceptual inquiry, as we first see in Socrates. At the beginning of the concepts comes the being God, to which we return with everything we have. Indeed, according to Aristotle, the main task of philosophy is to examine individual things that are facts in themselves. Plato, the teacher of Aristotle, has guided his student in many ways. He may even be ahead of his student in bringing up these issues. Nevertheless, since Aristotle's way of dealing with subjects is based on definition and determination, he was more successful than his teacher in presenting the subjects systematically. The construction of philosophy with ontological issues and concepts. Let's try to move on to the fundamental problems based on the quote we made above. When we think about the word being, that is, when we try to understand the meaning of this word, we realize that we need to ask two basic questions: why and how? Greek thought tried to explain these questions around these two concepts: change and movement. This is related to the two meanings of being. There is a difference between the following existence of beings like humans, that is, they're coming into the world or being born, and the existence of a being that never came into existence but always existed, that is, an unborn being. Plato, 2001. This distinction between them is actually related to change. The desire to exist on its own, selfishness also leads to its own destruction. Krantz, 1994. When we said change, what came to mind was nature. The place to be considered when nature was mentioned was the earth. But the point on which this nature rested was the sky. Indeed, when the unity of earth and sky gained integrity with the explanations of philosophers, it began to be called the cosmos, that is, an order. The observable knowledge of being in terms of being leads us to understand the causes of change in nature in this sense. The revelation of the knowledge of what exists in terms of existence leads to the determination of what is unchanging behind the changing nature. The fact that Aristotle defines this as first philosophy gives us an idea. In this sense, what is unchanging is actually the first. The word principle comes from here. And the first one has a fundamental place that derives its existence only from itself. But everything in nature and the universe begins to exist by taking existence from it. Ontology's questions about what the first being is lead us to theology. The point we need to pay attention to here is that although theology is a fundamental science, it is impossible to construct it. As we will see later, according to Aristotle, the first philosophers who tried to determine what the first state of being was by comparing it to the human form are Homer and Hesiod. But let us state that we do not see them as people who do philosophy in the sense that we use it today, that is, examining being as being. Nevertheless, these first determinations about the source of being should be seen as the first steps of the mature form that will later be reached in the hands of Aristotle. These are the people who, for Aristotle, are searching for the ark, that is, the source. Arche is the original matter behind changing nature, and the original is permanent. In other words, the proportions, densities, and forms of this original matter change, but the matter always remains the same matter. Then we can say that there is a development beyond change. Gunenk, 2020. Some of the fundamental concepts of ontology have been time and space. Space is the form of the object, and time is the measure of the movement of that object. This leads us to the conditions of being and existence of the object. Therefore, ontology is a discipline that comprehensively explains its subject within the framework of concepts such as change, time, and space, which are related to the structure and nature of reality, called categories by Aristotle. Here perhaps we should get help directly from Aristotle. Some things exist only in actuality, some things exist only potentially, and some things exist both in actuality and potentially. This applies to substance, quantity, and other categories. Finally, there is no movement apart from things.